When Republic Aviation test pilot Lowry Brabham first saw the prototype P-47 Thunderbolt on the tarmac in May 1941, his reaction was immediate and unprintable. The aircraft was grotesque. A bloated fuselage wider than a barrel sat behind the largest propeller he'd ever seen on a fighter. The cockpit perched so far back that forward visibility looked impossible. The whole thing appeared to weigh about as much as a medium bomber. Brabham climbed into the cockpit, started the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, and prepared himself for disappointment. 30 minutes later, after ringing the prototype through every maneuver he could imagine, Brabham landed and told Republic's engineers they'd built something extraordinary. It flew like a fighter, it dove like a meteor, and it felt indestructible. The P-47 Thunderbolt, destined to become the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II, had just proven that mass and performance weren't mutually exclusive. This is the story of how American engineers built a fighter around the biggest engine available, created an aircraft pilots initially despised, and ended up with the most versatile combat aircraft of the European War. A machine that could escort bombers at 30,000 feet in the morning and strafe trains at treetop level in the afternoon, absorbing battle damage that would destroy any other fighter and bringing its pilot home alive. The P-47's origin story begins with failure and corporate desperation. In 1939, Republic Aviation was a struggling company with limited prospects. Their previous fighter design, the P-43 Lancer, was already obsolete before it entered production. The Army Air Corps wanted high-altitude fighters capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. Republic's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, studied the requirements and reached a radical conclusion: forget trying to build a lightweight, nimble fighter. Build the fighter around the most powerful engine available and use brute force to overcome any performance penalties from weight. The engine Kartveli chose was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder two-row radial that produced 2,000 horsepower. This was not a delicate precision instrument. It was an industrial sledgehammer weighing over a ton by itself. The engine was so large that building a fighter around it seemed absurd. Conventional wisdom said radial engines belonged on bombers and attack aircraft, not fighters. Radials created excessive drag from their large frontal area. They blocked forward visibility. They were heavy. Inline engines like the Merlin offered better streamlining, lighter weight, and cleaner aerodynamics. Kartveli ignored conventional wisdom. He designed the P-47 from the engine outward. The massive radial required a large cowling, so Kartveli made the fuselage wider to accommodate proper airflow. The large frontal area created drag, so he added turbocharging to boost high-altitude performance. The turbocharger system required complex ducting running from the engine to the turbine mounted behind the cockpit and back again, which added weight, so he strengthened the airframe structure. The strengthened structure added more weight, so he increased wing area to maintain acceptable wing loading. Every solution created new problems that required additional solutions, each adding weight and complexity. The result was monstrous by fighter standards. The prototype, XP-47B, weighed over 12,000 pounds empty, double the weight of a Spitfire. Fully loaded with fuel ammunition and pilot combat weight, exceeded 17,000 pounds. For comparison, a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber weighed 20,000 pounds empty. The P-47 was approaching bomber weight while trying to function as a fighter. Critics within the Army Air Corps called it a joke. They said it would never outmaneuver enemy fighters. They predicted it would be a death trap. Then Lowry Brabham flew it. The prototype exceeded 400 miles per hour in level flight. It climbed to 15,000 feet in 5 minutes despite weighing 7 tons. It rolled faster than any fighter Brabham had flown. In dives, it accelerated past 500 miles per hour without control problems. The massive R2800 engine spinning a 13-foot propeller produced thrust that overcame the weight penalty. The turbocharger maintained sea-level power at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where thin air normally strangled piston engines. The wide-track landing gear made ground handling docile, The thick wing absorbed battle damage without structural failure. Every characteristic that looked like a flaw on paper worked brilliantly in practice. The Army Air Corps ordered the P-47 into production in September 1941. Republic built a massive new factory in Evansville, Indiana, specifically to manufacture Thunderbolts. By the time the first production aircraft rolled off the line in March 1942, America was at war and desperate for long-range fighters. The P-47 looked like exactly what the 8th Air Force needed, an aircraft with enough range and performance to escort bombers over Germany. Pilots who transitioned to the Thunderbolt from lighter fighters like the P-40 or P-39 hated it initially. The cockpit sat far behind the engine, making forward visibility during takeoff and landing difficult. The aircraft required nearly a mile of runway to get airborne when fully loaded. It felt sluggish at low altitude compared to nimbler fighters. Most damning, it didn't look like a fighter. It looked like someone had strapped wings to a water heater. Pilots gave it nicknames that weren't affectionate: the Jug, because its fuselage resembled a milk jug; the 7-ton milk truck; the flying bathtub. The first P-47 groups arrived in England in late 1942 and began operations in early 1943. Their mission would bomber Escort, protecting B-17 and B-24 formations during daylight raids over occupied Europe. Initial combat reports were mixed. The P-47 could reach the bombers at 25,000 feet and maintain position without strain. Its 8 .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, delivered devastating firepower. The turbocharger gave it excellent high-altitude performance, but it couldn't match the climb rate or turning performance of German Bf-109s and FW-190s at medium altitudes. In a turning fight below 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was at a disadvantage. Then pilots discovered what the Jug could do that other fighters couldn't. It could dive. Not just dive, but accelerate in a dive, faster than any fighter in the European theatre. German pilots learned quickly that trying to escape a Thunderbolt by diving was suicide. The P-47 would follow, accelerate past them, and maintain control at speeds that would tear the wings off a Bf-109. Pilots reported diving past 550 miles per hour near the speed of sound without structural failure or control problems. The massive airframe and thick wings that made the P-47 heavy also made it immensely strong. More importantly, pilots discovered the Thunderbolt could absorb punishment that would destroy any other fighter. The R-2800 engine, with its 2 rows of 9 cylinders, could lose multiple cylinders to battle damage and continue running. The air-cooled radial had no vulnerable coolant system to rupture, no radiators, no coolant lines, no risk of instant engine failure from a single bullet hole. The wide fuselage provided space for redundant systems. The cockpit featured more armor plating than any other American fighter. Pilots came back with aircraft that had taken dozens of hits with cylinders blown off the engine, with massive holes in the wings and fuselage, and the Thunderbolts kept flying. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's experience on June 26, 1943 became legendary and fundamentally changed how pilots viewed the P-47. During an escort mission over France, Johnson's Thunderbolt was attacked by German fighters and hit repeatedly. Cannon shells destroyed his canopy, wounded him in the leg, severed his radio and oxygen systems, and riddled the fuselage with holes. His engine was hit multiple times, but continued running. With half his instruments destroyed and blood filling his boot, Johnson flew 200 miles back to England at low altitude, landed successfully, and walked away from an aircraft that ground crews counted over 200 bullet and shell holes in. The Jug had brought him home when any other fighter would have gone down. Stories like Johnson's spread through the fighter groups. Pilots who had complained about the P-47's weight and lack of maneuverability started appreciating its survivability. The nickname Jug stopped being derisive and became affectionate. You could trust the Jug. It would take hits and keep flying. It would absorb damage and bring you home. In a war where a single bullet in the cooling system could doom a pilot in a liquid-cooled fighter, the Thunderbolt's redundancy was life insurance. The escort mission evolved through 1943. Early operations kept fighters tightly bound to bomber formations, restricting offensive maneuvering. General Jimmy Doolittle changed these tactics in early 1944 authorizing fighters to pursue German aircraft aggressively rather than maintaining rigid defensive positions. This freed Thunderbolt pilots to use their aircraft's strengths, superior diving speed, heavy firepower, and high-altitude performance to hunt German fighters throughout their operational envelope. But the P-47's greatest transformation came when pilots took it down to the deck for ground attack missions. Fighter Command initially resisted using expensive fighters for ground attack, considering it wasteful. That changed after D-Day in June 1944, when Allied forces needed tactical air support for the ground campaign across France. The P-47 proved perfectly suited for this mission in ways nobody had anticipated during its design. The Jug's massive airframe could carry external ordnance that would overload lighter fighters. Early ground attack missions carried 2 500-pound bombs under the wings. Later variants carried up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, or 10 5-inch rockets, or combinations of bombs and rockets that exceeded the payload of some light bombers. The 850 caliber machine guns loaded with armor-piercing ammunition could destroy light vehicles and suppress anti-aircraft positions. The armored cockpit and rugged structure provided protection against ground fire that shredded lighter aircraft. Pilots discovered the R2800 engine's reliability was equally valuable at low altitude as at 30,000 feet. Flying close to the ground meant constant exposure to small arms fire, light anti-aircraft guns, and debris from explosions. The P-47 absorbed this punishment and kept flying. A single hit in the coolant system would doom a P-51 or Spitfire at low altitude, leaving no time to gain altitude before the engine seized. The air-cooled R2800 kept running even with multiple cylinders damaged, giving pilots time to reach friendly territory or find a place to crash land. The ground attack mission became the Thunderbolt's signature role. Fighter-bomber groups roamed across occupied Europe in 1944–45, attacking trains, trucks, tanks, airfields, supply depots, bridges, and anything else that moved. The term cab rank described their tactics. Aircraft circled over the battlefield waiting for targets, then dove to attack when ground controllers identified objectives. The psychological impact on German forces was enormous. Any movement during daylight invited attack from Thunderbolts that appeared without warning, destroyed their targets, and disappeared before effective anti-aircraft response. The statistics from these ground attack operations were staggering. P-47 groups claimed destruction of thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks and armoured vehicles, and countless smaller targets. The accuracy of these claims was debatable. Pilots often overestimated damage in the confusion of combat, but the cumulative effect on German logistics was undeniable. Moving supplies and reinforcements during daylight became suicidal. German forces increasingly operated only at night, which slowed response times and degraded operational effectiveness. One particular mission profile demonstrated the P-47's versatility perfectly. Groups would take off from England or forward bases in France carrying bombs and drop tanks. They'd climb to 25,000 feet and escort bombers deep into Germany, fighting off interceptors if necessary. After the bombers turned for home, the Thunderbolts would descend to low-altitude attack targets of opportunity trains, vehicles, airfields, with their remaining ammunition and bombs, then return home. No other fighter in the European theatre could perform this mission profile. The P-51 had better range, but couldn't carry comparable ordnance loads. The Spitfire had better maneuverability, but lacked range and payload capacity. The P-38 had range and payload, but was vulnerable to battle damage. The P-47 could do everything adequately and survive the experience. Pilot testimonials from late war operations consistently praised the Thunderbolt's reliability and toughness. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, a P-47 ace with over 20 kills, described it as the safest fighter to fly in combat. You could bring it back on one magneto with half the engine shot away, the rudder gone, the hydraulics out, and the prop in flat pitch. It would still fly. Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, called it the outstanding fighter bomber of World War II and credited its ruggedness with saving countless pilots who would have died in lighter aircraft. The P-47's ground attack effectiveness came at a cost. Low-altitude operations were dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire was dense and accurate near the front lines. Pilots who survived multiple high-altitude fighter missions sometimes died on their first ground attack sortie, caught by flak they never saw. The P-47's armour and redundancy improved survival odds, but nothing made ground attacks safe. Loss rates for fighter-bomber missions exceeded those for high-altitude escort, and the men who flew these missions knew they were rolling dice every time they dove toward a target. Yet they kept flying because the Thunderbolt kept bringing them home. After D-Day, when Allied forces pushed across France and into Germany, P-47 groups moved to forward airfields barely behind the front lines. They flew multiple missions per day, landing to refuel and rearm, then taking off again for another sortie. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep aircraft operational. The R-2800 engines required less maintenance than liquid-cooled engines, and the rugged airframe tolerated rough field conditions. The Thunderbolt's operational tempo exceeded what any other fighter could sustain. By 1945, P-47 production exceeded 15,000 aircraft, more than any other American fighter except the P-51. Thunderbolts equipped 28 fighter groups in the European theatre alone, plus additional groups in the Mediterranean Pacific and China, Burma, India theatres. The aircraft Republic, designed around a massive radial engine, had become ubiquitous, proving that brute force engineering could succeed where elegance failed. The contrast with the P-51 Mustang highlighted the Thunderbolt's unique characteristics. The Mustang was everything the P-47 wasn't: sleek, lightweight, aerodynamically refined, optimized for efficiency. It had better range, higher top speed at most altitudes, and looked like it was going fast, sitting still. Pilots who transitioned from Thunderbolts to Mustangs praised the Mustang's performance and responsiveness, but they also noted nervously that the Mustang felt fragile by comparison. A single hit in the coolant system meant immediate engine failure. The lighter structure meant battle damage that the Thunderbolt would shrug off could be catastrophic in the Mustang. The question of which fighter was better depends entirely on the mission and the pilot's priorities. For long-range bomber escort deep into Germany, the Mustang's superior range and speed made it preferable. For ground attack against heavily defended targets, the Thunderbolt's payload capacity and survivability were unmatched. For pilots who valued the ability to absorb battle damage and keep flying, the choice was simple: they flew the Jug. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but the Thunderbolt continued serving in the Pacific theatre until Japan's surrender. Post-war, the P-47 remained in service with Air National Guard units through the 1950s, long after most World War II fighters had been retired. Foreign air forces operated Thunderbolts into the 1960s. The aircraft's rugged construction and reliable engine made it ideal for nations with limited maintenance infrastructure. The legacy of the P-47 extends beyond its combat record. It proved that unconventional design approaches could succeed when executed properly. Alexander Kartvelyi's decision to build around the largest available engine, accepting weight penalties, and designing for strength over elegance, created an aircraft that excelled in roles nobody anticipated during its design. The Thunderbolt wasn't supposed to be a ground attack aircraft. It was designed for high-altitude bomber escort. But its inherent characteristics made it perfect for low-altitude missions that would have destroyed more delicate fighters. The Thunderbolt also demonstrated that pilot survival and aircraft reliability were combat multipliers as important as performance specifications. An aircraft that consistently brought pilots home allowed those pilots to accumulate experience, which made them more effective in combat, which meant more enemy aircraft destroyed and more missions completed successfully. The Thunderbolt's survivability wasn't glamorous, but it was decisive. Dead pilots don't learn from their mistakes. Dead pilots don't train replacement pilots. Dead pilots don't complete missions. The Jug kept pilots alive long enough to become veterans, and veterans won wars. Looking at restored P-47s at airshows today, the aircraft's proportions still seem wrong. The fuselage is too wide. The cockpit sits too far back. The engine looks oversized. Then the R2800 starts, and the sound explains everything, a deep, thunderous roar that vibrates your chest from 100 yards away. This wasn't designed to be pretty. It was designed to work, to fight, to survive, to bring its pilot home. The pilots who flew it understood this better than anyone. They called it the Jug, and the nickname stopped being an insult and became a term of endearment for the aircraft that saved their lives. They learned to love its indestructibility because indestructibility meant survival, and survival meant going home after the war. The P-47 wasn't the fastest fighter, it wasn't the most maneuverable, it wasn't the longest ranged, but it was the toughest, and in combat, tough matters more than elegant. Republic Aviation built 15 686 P-47 Thunderbolts during World War II. They cost $83,000 each, expensive by 1940s standards, but cheap compared to a pilot's life. The aircraft destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in air combat, tens of thousands of vehicles and trains on the ground, and brought home countless pilots who would have died in less robust aircraft. It served in every theatre where American forces fought, excelled in roles from high-altitude escort to low-altitude ground attack, and earned a reputation for reliability that made it the most trusted fighter in the 8th Air Force. Alexander Kartvel's gamble, building a fighter around brute force rather than finesse, paid off beyond anyone's expectations. The massive, ugly aircraft that test pilot Lowry Brabham thought looked absurd in 1941 became the most versatile combat aircraft of the European War. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved that in war, sometimes the tank of the sky beats the thoroughbred racehorse, not through elegance or efficiency, but through the simple virtue of being impossible to kill. That's the legacy of the Jug, not the most celebrated fighter, not the subject of the most books or movies, but the one that pilots trusted to bring them home. In the end, that's what mattered most. The P-47 wasn't built to win awards for aesthetic design. It was built to win a war and save lives. It accomplished both objectives with brutal efficiency, and no aircraft in World War II did it better.